Our video is going to be covering the skeletal structures of the scapula, clavicle, and the humerus. We're going to start with the scapula. The scapula is a bony, it's a bone that lies on the posterior part of the body at the posterior portion of the rib cage. Now, one thing that I need to mention, since we've been having discussions about joints and things, the scapulothoracic joint is called a faux joint. The scapulothoracic joint, or where the scapula articulates with the thorax, it does not contain any characteristics of the joints that we have talked about thus far. It doesn't contain any fibrous or cartilaginous or synovial structures that would make it a joint. However, the scapulothoracic faux joint is highly movable and an important piece of the shoulder joint, or the glenohumeral joint. The thing that provides the stability for the scapula is going to be muscular attachment, and when we get into muscles, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there are 17 muscles which attach to the scapula in total. Those muscles are what provide stability for the scapula here on the posterior portion of the body. You'll also notice that the scapula lies, because of the curved nature of the back, the scapula itself lies in what is called the scapular plane off of the ribs. And the scapular plane is about 30 degrees off of the frontal plane. So the scapula tends to sit at about 30 degrees off of this frontal plane. Because the scapula, because of its joint structure, its faux joint structure, and its location, the scapula is highly movable, and it glides on the ribs as the humerus moves. There are several movements of the scapula that can be seen here. The scapula can elevate, depress, adduct, and abduct, as well as upwardly rotate and downwardly rotate. So a wide array of movements possible at the scapula, the scapulothoracic joint. Moving into the clavicle. So the clavicle, if you pause and just do a large overview thought about the upper extremity, the clavicle becomes a very important piece and component of the upper extremity, although it's a relatively not oft thought of bone as part of the upper extremity. But the clavicle is the only attachment point of the upper extremity to the axial skeleton. I'm going to say that one more time so you can think about it. The clavicle, the sternal end of the clavicle, is the only attachment point of the upper extremity to the axial skeleton, and that happens at the sternoclavicular joint. So the clavicle is a very important component of the upper extremity. It's going to lie just above the first rib, a flat acromial end, and a more knobby sternal end. It is considered a long bone, although it does not have a medullary cavity. Additionally, the clavicle is the first bone to begin ossification within the body, but it's the last bone to finish after the age of 20. As a side note, the clavicle is also an interesting bone because it is a bone that undergoes both intramembranous and cartilaginous ossification at different respective ends. So a lot of cool things going on with the clavicle. I mentioned that the clavicle is the only attachment point to the axial skeleton. So the clavicle acts, in biomechanics they call it a strut. The clavicle acts like a strut, allowing for maximal range of motion of the upper extremity. Again, if you just do a big broad overview, the glenohumeral joint has a tremendous amount of range of motion, and in fact has the most range of motion of any joint in the body. The clavicle is one of the things that allows for the free range of motion at the glenohumeral joint because it creates a stable surface for which everything may move upon. So the clavicle has a secure attachment to the sternum, although we'll get to this in just a moment. It does have a movable portion here at the sternoclavicular joint. but then it acts as a piece that sticks out and provides attachment for the rest of the upper extremity in a free hanging motion. And so it allows the scapula to be highly movable, and then the humerus is going to continue that motion, that tremendous amount of motion. So we'll move in. There's a few points about the clavicle, or landmark points that you should take a moment and look through. And then the thing that I wanted to make sure to get to here is that this attachment of the clavicle at the sternum is an important piece, and it's made up of an articular disc and is its own joint. So the sternoclavicular joint is a saddle joint which allows for elevation and rotation, both important movements as the humerus moves through its various ranges of motion. This disc, because we have two incongruent surfaces of the saddle joint with the clavicle meeting the sternum here, this disc allows for maximal congruence, maybe. It's a strong reinforcement and increases the distance between the articular surfaces for more range of motion. And if you actually come in and just feel that sternoclavicular joint on your own body as this video is happening, you can actually come in and feel that joint space and then abduct and adduct your arm, and you'll be able to feel that clavicle as it elevates and rotates posteriorly or anteriorly during various movements of the humerus. So an important saddle joint here for the sternoclavicular joint. Finally, that brings us to the final bone of this video, the humerus. Before I move off of this slide, I want you to take just a second and appreciate. From an anterior view, we can come down here and see the medial epicondyle with the capitulum and the trochlea. We can see the tubercles and the intertubercular line. But the thing that we don't have a very good view on from an anterior view is the humeral head. Okay, so we've got the anatomical neck and the surgical neck, but we don't actually have a very good view on the humerus here. Whereas from a posterior view, again, we can see our medial epicondyle, we can see our olecranon fossa over here with our lateral epicondyle. From a posterior view, we have a much better view of the humeral head. So outside of these bony landmarks, one of the things that I would like you to glean about the humerus is some of these angles that occur at the humeral head. So the humeral head is angled in two planes. It's angled in two different planes. It's angled in a frontal plane and in a frontal plane and maybe a transverse plane actually over here. So it's angled in those two planes. So the first angle is this called the angle of inclination. So here's the shaft of the humerus. It's this point from the center of the humeral head up through its the middle of its articular surface. And so this angle is typically 130 to 150 degrees, and 135 is the most common found in a population. Another angle that occurs at the humerus is called the angle of retroversion. Let me skip ahead one slide and see if we can have a better view on this. So the angle of retroversion, maybe I'll come back to this side. The angle of retroversion is how much the humeral head is rotated anterior or posterior in relation to the medial and lateral epicondyles. So I'll come back to this slide here. So along the length of the bone, so when we lay this bone flat, how much rotation anterior or posterior occurs at this humeral head from this axis of rotation at the medial and lateral epicondyles. So we come back to this point here. So here is the angle of the medial and lateral epicondyles cutting through the bone lengthwise, and then you'll see that this humeral head is rotated about 30 degrees off of that plane. It's rotated posteriorly, and so we call that retroversion. If it had been rotated towards the anterior, we would call that anteverted. Anteverted. But because it is rotated away, we call it retroverted. So I'm going to come here to this slide again, highlighting the angle of inclination. Here is another view on this medial and lateral epicondyle with the angle of anteversion or retroversion, in this case retroversion of the humeral head. And then one thing that I want to point out to you guys is the scapular plane is about 30 degrees. Now, there's a wide array, we'll see this on a coming up slide, there's actually a wide array of the amount of retroversion that can occur at the humeral head. However, you'll notice that if the humeral head is retroverted about 30 degrees, and in most people that's the case, it actually aligns perfect with this scapular plane. So the 30 degrees of retroversion meets the 30 degree scapular plane, and so that when the humerus meets the scapula and it hangs at our side, our arm is able to hang fairly straight because these angles meet up. It's a potential reason for this degree of retroversion during development. Here's another view on this retroversion. So here is the plane through the medial and lateral epicondyle of the humerus. You'll notice that the humeral head is retroverted about 30 degrees, and that 30 degrees is going to meet this scapular plane fairly well. Now, I mentioned just a second ago that there's actually a fair amount of variability in the amount of anteversion and retroversion that is found in the humeral head. Something interesting that I found was as the retroversion of the humeral head changes, it actually equates to differences in the amount of internal and external rotation that is found at the glenohumeral joint. So if someone is about 30, then we're going to see similar amounts of internal and external rotation. If someone is more towards anteversion or less retroverted, so they're 20 degrees of retroversion or 10 degrees or 0 degrees or even anteverted a degree or two, then that person will have excessive amounts of internal rotation with limited external rotation. And then if a person is, they experience additional retroversion, so beyond that 30 degrees, it translates often into a range of motion change with more external rotation and less internal rotation. Just make sure you take a moment and go through these anatomical landmarks on the slide, and that finishes this video of the scapula, clavicle, and humerus.